Okay, so as promised, this is part 4. We're moving away from Trent Horn and Father Casey. But as I said, the best case against Trent Horn's argument, not against Trent Horn himself, but against his argument, is Bart Ehrman's case. Now, this is not the strongest version of Bart Ehrman's argument, but this covers the broadest range of all his arguments on this topic. And he's going to be speaking to someone who is taught at a Catholic school, someone who is a Christian. Obviously, Ehrman's an atheist. So we're going to get through it. We're going to talk about this, and I hope you like it. Okay, so let's start.
Can you just kind of summarize your views? About the Bible condemning homosexuality?
All right. Well, to summarize, there are 6 passages in the Bible that deal in some way, shape, or form with same-sex relations. 3 in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament, the Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy 1. The Genesis 19 passage is talking about sexual violence and rape. The Levitical passages are quite explicit in condemning same-sex sex between men, but the larger context of the Holiness Code makes it difficult to say, yes, these should be interpreted literally because of all the other things that are condemned that we have no problem with. And then in the New Testament, the 1 Corinthians 6 passage has to do with probably male prostitution, and the same in 1 Timothy. And the Romans 1 passage has to do with idolatry and people who, the pagans who are guilty of idolatry, they tend towards things that Paul considers unnatural. The problem is that Paul's understanding of nature as unchanging and our understanding of nature as unchanging is difficult. And the understanding of sexual orientation is not one that the ancients had, that we do. And even in our own time, just in the last century, as everybody knows, we've seen some rather sweeping change in societal attitudes towards people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, or transgender. The fight still goes on, but
Left out bisexual and pansexual. But okay.
Here we are.
Okay. So I think I might point out, just to put you in the public view here, that Jeff, you, unlike me, you're a Christian.
I am, yeah.
And you're actually an ordained minister. And so this is not like a crazy atheist teaching at Chapel Hill talking. You really don't think that this is that the Bible's condemning what we think of as homosexual, or that it's applicable to our situation.
I would also point out, I got into this whole discussion really quite by accident, because I was on a committee in LA for the Presbyterian Church that oversaw the ordination process. And since Presbyterians have to learn Hebrew and Greek, I was the language geek on the committee, examining people. And there was a gay man, Chris Glasser. He wrote a book called Uncommon Calling, A Gay Man's Struggle to Serve the Church. And he came up for whether we would approve him to be ordained, and I didn't know what to do. And I abstained from the vote. He was not passed, and I decided I better find out what I think and why. And so that's what led to the first thing I published, which was way back in 87, I think, and then the book. So change comes slowly.
It's hard for people. It's hard for people to kind of think differently from how they've been raised, but it is thankfully it's a very serious movement within Christianity now.
Yes.
To take seriously the fact that we're living in a different age.
Yes.
And it is happening, but there's a lot of resistance as well, as you've said.
And
welcome you to this special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. This week, I'm not being interviewed by Megan. I'm interviewing a fellow scholar and friend of mine, Jeffrey Syker, who is an expert on a large number of things, including the questions dealing with homosexuality in the Bible. I've known Jeff Syker for, 40 years.
40 years.
40 years.
Hold on, I want to play this game real quick. Let me see. I think I have that book. I have these books right there. I don't know. I have these. Let me see. I don't know what that is. There was another video earlier where I almost had every single book that was on the screen from a different apologist, commentator, whatever. And I don't have enough Bart Ehrman books. That's what that comes down to.
Jeff was 2 years behind me at Princeton Theological Seminary in our PhD programs. Jeff had come to Princeton in 1983. He did a master's degree at Yale before coming to Princeton Seminary. Jeff was 2 years behind me, and when he graduated from Princeton Seminary, he went on for a long-term teaching career at Loyola Marymount University in California, in Los Angeles. This was an interesting teaching career for him because Jeff is actually a Presbyterian and Loyola Marymount is Jesuit. And so,
yes, it is.
And so he's a wide-ranging guy. So
I just wanted to kind of cover the bona fides there. We're going to skip ahead real quick. The point is that neither of these are wackadoos. Neither of these are going to be giving minority opinions.
Jeff was a professor of theological studies there in the Department of Theological Studies, and he was the chair of that department for a long time. He also was the chair of classics and archaeology.
Not at the same time.
Not at the same time, luckily. So, and Jeff has done a lot of things in a lot of different areas, including a lot of things. And one of his main interests is actually in Jewish and Christian relationships in the ancient world. For a spell, he was a fellow at the Hartman Institute for Jewish Christian relations in Jerusalem for a couple summers. Jeff is an accomplished author and scholar, principally of the New Testament, but he's an expert in the Bible generally and in early Christianity. He has written or edited 8 books over the years. His most recent one is on sin. Right. Okay. So Jeff, we're going to talk about homosexuality and the Bible. And as I know, and as people are going to know, your basic view, tell me if I'm misstating this, because I don't mean to be misstating it, but your basic view is that the Bible does not condemn what we think of as homosexuality. Is that fair to say?
Basically. Yeah. Basically.
Okay, well, give me the 1 or 2 sentence correct view.
Beyond basic. Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is that the language of homosexuality, the term itself, when applied to the Bible, is somewhat anachronistic and even in the 20th century, there have been different understandings of what homosexuality means. At the beginning of the 20th century, homosexuality was largely seen as a perverse choice against nature, which, has been the long tradition over the centuries. But then by the mid-50s, you start having language of homosexuality as a preference, which is...
Just to be clear, he's talking about the general language in the culture. He's not talking about the academic language yet.
It's still a choice, but it's a preference, but much more neutral language. And then finally, towards the end of the 20th century, and now especially, the language is all about orientation, so that it's not a choice you make. It's like eye color or handedness. It's something you discover about yourself. And so it's natural. And so whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, homosexuality was seen as unnatural.
You're wondering why his choice of wording there. One of the arguments about naturalism has to do with the right hand and left hand when it comes to homosexuality and other things like this. Left-handedness used to be seen as an aberration, as an evil even. So since it was an evil, since it was wrong, people would be corrected to write with the right hand until people realized they were being silly and they were being stupid. And so they started letting people write with whatever hand they wanted to do. Some people ended up being ambidextrous. Most people stayed right-handed, but a large influx of left-handedness happened once it was allowed to come about naturally. You can read in all the analogies and metaphors there that you want.
And you could quote, we'll get to the Romans 1 passage, that it's against nature. By the end of the 20th century, people are using actually the argument from nature that, well, no, this is part of the variety of sexual orientations.
So you're saying that they used to use the argument for nature to show that homosexuality was sinful or wrong, and now they use the argument from nature to say that in fact it's a natural phenomenon.
And the reason for that is that you do see homosexual acts in animals, and you do see pair bonding in some animals, and some animals that pair bond with same-sex couples. That doesn't go a very long way when it crosses over to human evolution, because that could be a unique evolutionary track for the particular animal, or our species could have a unique evolutionary track that would not congeal well with the broader evolutionary track of other animals. That's fine. Aberrations happen, but that's the argument, and it's not a terrible argument. So that's why personally like saying that God calls us to be something greater than human. It's a call to be divine, not to be natural, but supernatural. Yeah, I wonder where I heard that before.
Yeah, it's rather ironic.
It is ironic.
That gets turned on its head. The other thing I would say is that the fight within the churches about homosexuality is rather different, depending upon whether you're in the Roman Catholic tradition or in the Protestant tradition. In the Roman Catholic tradition, it's all about procreation. That's the issue. It's not about whether somebody can be ordained who is openly gay, because in the Catholic Church, of course, all priests are supposedly celibate. And
there are actually some rules about being same-sex attracted and being in the clergy. There are actually some rules there. So he's not exactly accurate there. That being said, it is a call to be celibate, and not just for the priest, but for the whole congregation. And there's even a type of celibacy in marriage where marriage itself is not seen as fornication. I know for a lot of people that's a hard leap. But the point is that it's not the act of sex, it's illicit sex versus licit sex, which is a different thing altogether. So, for instance, oral sex would be illicit, even though it would be in the confines of marriage, still wouldn't be allowable. Just kind of give you an idea there. But what he's saying in general, even though not specifically correct, in general is correct. And I think that's one of the mistakes that someone like Trent Horn is making by trying to bring in the failed Protestant fight into Catholic Church. We already have a different approach that works for the most part. I don't think bringing in a failed Protestant approach is a good idea. It's going to push more people away than it's going to bring in. And it's going to push people out that were already in. So I just think it's a mistake. And I know I've spoken harsher about that, especially in my first video of the series. You can slightly put that to me being upset and me being offended, but I hold true to what I said in all my videos up until this point. So the way that Trent Horn, Tim Staples, and Patrick Coffin, they don't speak on this topic very well. They sound Protestant and they sound fire and brimstone Southern Baptist preacher. It's unfortunate that we're using Protestant language when trying to communicate a message that is very different.
So it doesn't matter technically if you're gay or not because you're celibate. The issue is procreation. And the Protestant tradition, it has nothing to do with procreation. It's all about ordination and
there is a problem with priests who don't want to practice celibacy.
Modeling what a Christian life should be like. And so can an openly gay person model the Christian faith? And all of these arguments go back to the 6 texts that we're going to discuss in the Bible, 3 in the Old Testament, our Hebrew Bible, 3 in the New Testament. My position is that you have to take into account the cultural contexts in which same-sex relations were broached in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And those contexts are rather different than our contexts today. The other fight that goes on is whether nature is the same at all times and in all places, or whether our understanding of nature and what's natural develops and changes over time. And so you end up with rather different understandings of the applicability of these passages.
Okay.
I also spoke on this in I think in my previous video, but I was speaking more of it in the linguistic sense, which is words themselves change context and change meaning over time. So it could be the same word with a different meaning, which makes it very difficult in translation because not only is that a moving target, but you also are a moving target because your language is developing, which makes it very complicated to figure out exactly what time period something was written. If secular and, let's call it pious academia, have different opinions on when something was written, that changes the proper word that should be used to translate a specific word. So if someone thinks something was written in the Stone Age, but someone else says it was written in the Iron Age, well, that's a huge difference in context and meaning and culture.
There are a lot of people who are going to be very interested in sort of Christian attitudes and what happens in denominations these days. And a lot of people are just interested in what the Bible says. And I think a lot of people are going to say that, look, the Bible's, it's pretty clear. And so the passages better than I do, but especially the people point to these 2 verses in the book of Leviticus.
That's right.
So Leviticus 18:22 said, let me just read it to you so you can't
go for it.
Wiggle out of this.
Yeah,
It says,
I'll wiggle.
It says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Okay. And then 2 chapters later, so it's an abomination for a man to lie with a man. And then the 2 chapters later, in chapter 20, verse 13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them.
Pretty serious.
That sure sounds like the Bible's condemning homosexuality.
Well, again, you have to ask, what are they talking about? And the context is crucial. So the context of both of these passages in Leviticus is what's called the Holiness Code. And this is instructions given to the people as they're getting ready to go into the land, the promised land that God has given them. And basically, God is saying, don't do the things that the people who I'm kicking out of the land, don't do the things that they did because it was idolatrous and against my law. And the difficulty...
Before he continues on, I'm actually very curious because I love studying ancient cultures. I have books on Mycenaean Greece. I have books on Sabine, Free, Roman, Latium. I am very curious if there's actually any evidence of, high percentages of homosexual relationships in pre-Canaanite culture of, what do I call it, the Levant? Whatever that area is, or even among the Canaanites themselves. Is there evidence of this very different culture, pre-Israeli culture? I just don't think there is. The Hyksos, the Israelite, the Semitics, they're all genetically the same group. As far as I know, the layers of the dirt, when you're going through that in archaeology, you don't see a huge leap. You don't see a lot of Egyptian influence, and you don't see a huge leap from Canaanite to Israeli culture. You see a development, of course, but as far as I know, the archaeology shows that it's roughly the same culture. Similar rules, similar societal bonds, similar societal rules. So I'd be interested to see, I don't know that there is or isn't, I want to be very clear. I'd be interested to see studies showing that there is a huge difference in culture between the pre-Israeli Canaanite culture and the post-Israelic early Hebrew culture, whether that be the Hyksos or whether it be the Semitic Israelites or whatever these people are right before the Davidic kingdom. I'd be interested to see if there is truly a striking difference or if they're roughly the same group, socially, societally, culturally.
There's no rationale given for the prohibition. They're just prohibitions, one with a rather severe punishment, but there are all kinds of other prohibitions, against wearing garments made of 2 different materials, sowing 2 different kinds of seed in the same field, getting a tattoo, shaving your beard into a point. And so it looks like the condemnation is of various practices of the people who preceded them in the land. And so there's a generic just kind of condemnation of don't do those kinds of things, especially mixing different things.
So the idea then is, what you're saying then, you're admitting that this says that men should not sleep with men, but You're saying you're also not supposed to wear a sweater that's also made of cotton and polyester or something because...
Well, and that's the difficulty. How do you pick and choose? Jesus says in Matthew, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law, and whoever relaxes the least of...
So I recently talked about this, about how, I think it was in my last video, about how do you divide such a fine line. I have received the book that I ordered on John Chrysostom, The Case Against Judaizing. I did not purchase, I believe it's by St. Basil, or it could be a different one, on the cessation of the laws. It's not Basil because I think it's a medieval church doctor of the faith. But I didn't order that one just because I have over 100 books to read right now. I have a 52 TBR list, and I have 100 books that I haven't read. So I'm going to avoid buying more books until I get through a good chunk of this TBR. But I do want to understand better how we choose which ones are the moral code and which ones are the social code that we can ignore. The reason why is because, let's say you want to say, well, it's the ones that say you're going to be put to death. Okay, well, you get put to death for being a rebellious son. So being a rebellious child gets you put to death. So if that's not part of the moral code, if just someone being sentenced to death doesn't make it on the level of moral code, I want a better explanation, better understanding of that. Anyway, continuing on.
And Jesus says in Matthew, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law. And whoever relaxes the least of these commandments will be least in the kingdom. Well, the rabbis had rather serious disagreements. In fact, one of the most interesting disagreements the rabbis had, and this is in the Talmudic times, a little later. So the question was, could a woman who has had sexual relations with a woman marry a rabbi? And one school of thought said, absolutely not, because she's defiled her body. Another school of thought said, well, what can she do? She doesn't have semen. So, sure. And so understandings of same-sex relations, it changes. And, as you know, in the Greco-Roman era, in both Greek culture and Roman culture, there are developing ideas about same-sex relations.
Okay.
And that also interplays with what the early Christians thought. And the Jews, mostly they were familiar with some practices in the Greco-Roman world. And these are practices of idolaters. These are the practices of these people whom God would condemn.
Jeff, before we get to the Greco-Roman world, I want to ask you a little bit more about the Old Testament, because I'm still want to make sure I understand the point about these Old Testament passages. So it sounds like you're agreeing that, look, the law of Moses says a man's not supposed to sleep with a man, but it also says, this thing about not sowing your field. You're not supposed to put both barley and wheat in the same field,
Yes.
and there are these other things about pointed beards and things that nobody really thinks apply today.
Right.
And so the problem is that people, ignore 4/5 of the law or more as not being relevant, but they pick the one thing that they personally have an opinion about that, so they use the Bible to support their view, even though they're actually not saying the Bible is authoritative. They're just picking the one they want.
It's a non-contextual reading of the Bible, both historically, culturally, and also just, if you look at the passages, all you have to do is look at the passage just before and the passage just after, and you end up, as you say, cherry picking. Yeah, this doesn't apply, this does apply. And the question is, what kind of rationale is there?
So I've had more than a few atheists accuse not only the Catholic Church, but Christians in general of cherry picking. What I tend to do is I will appeal to the magisterium, and I will say that it's not just cherry picking, that we do have reasoned arguments. But I can see how that answer can be dissatisfying to an atheist who's coming into this blind, or to someone who's an anti-theist who used to be religious and might have found those answers dissatisfying in the first place, which might be part of why.
I have a lot of students, and you probably did too, who Christian students who will tell you that, what do you think of the law of Moses? And they say, well, I keep the 10 Commandments, but that's, I just think the 10 Commandments apply. But then you ask them, okay, have you ever had a job on a Saturday? Oh yeah. Well, but that's against the 10 Commandments. You can't work on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So they keep the 9 Commandments. So even with the 10 Commandments, like they're picking. And the thing is, people want to quote these verses from Leviticus to condemn same-sex relations. Why aren't they condemning people who are wearing sweaters and people who are?
Exactly.
It's because they just want an authority, and they find one rather than actually trusting the authority for what it says altogether.
The other thing that I think is important to say is that when you have passages and you're not exactly sure how to interpret them, it's typical to appeal to other sources of authority. Mm-hmm. So tradition is one source of authority. What have the elders taught? What has the church taught? Or not only tradition, but experience becomes an authority. I love this passage actually in Galatians, where Paul appeals to the experience of the Galatians. What was your experience in terms of the Spirit? How did you get the Spirit? And then finally, reason. Rational discourse becomes an authority. And when you put all these things together and you sift through, what the Bible has to say about same-sex relations, if you privilege tradition and scripture read out of context, then it's going to be a very conservative interpretation. If you privilege experience and reason, then you're going to come out in a much more liberal side.
But I would say that, most, in our context here, where you and I live in the South, experience and reason to interpret the Bible just means you're not listening to God. You think you know it all. And so, for people who believe in the Bible, it sounds like you and I prefer thinking about things. But some people just want to quote Bible verses. But you're saying that even those who do that aren't really doing that. They are using the reason. They're choosing.
They are.
They're choosing which things.
So, for example, people used to quote the Genesis 19 passage, Sodom and Gomorrah, because these two strangers visiting the city, happening to be angels, as it turns out, the townspeople want to know them, and there's a sexual overtone to that because Lot offers his daughters in place of the men. And the translation,
these guys are staying in Lot's house,
Yeah.
and the town gathers around, bangs on the door, and they want to know the men in the biblical sense.
In the biblical sense, that's exactly right. And the translations are all over the place. Almost all of them agree that this is the townspeople wanting to show dominance over these visitors, wanting to show power over these visitors. And so what mattered in antiquity was whether you were in the dominant or the submissive position. And so you want to be the male who penetrates rather than acting as a female who is penetrated. And this also carried over into Greco-Roman culture, where we do have evidence of same-sex relations, but what seems to most matter is whether you're in the dominant position or a passive position.
But so why does God bring down fire and brimstone on the people of Sodom and Gomorrah if it's not sexual? They want to rape these two men, right?
Well, yeah, rape. I mean, it's simply a further indication of how depraved Sodom and Gomorrah are. So, I mean, God has already pronounced judgment, but Abraham has bargained God down, as you know, to 10. If there are 10 righteous people, don't destroy the town. But they can't even find that, and they're wanting to rape these visitors.
You're saying the problem isn't that they want to have sex with men. The problem is they want to. I mean, these are guests in Lot's house, right?
So it's inhospitality, and it's the fact that it's a condemnation of sexual violence. Yeah.
Yeah, they're condemning. So it's condemning violence against these guests, and his sacred obligation is to protect his guests.
Yes,
that he takes so seriously that he says, I'll give you my two daughters."
That's the lesser sin.
Wow. Okay. Well, so apart from the kind of morality of all that,
cultures at different times develop different understandings of male-female sexual relations, male-male sexual relations, and so it's a moving target. I mean, there are certainly constants that you can find, but it's a moving target. And even in our own day today, I mean, if you look at Latino culture with notions of machismo, or if you look at African American culture, which is much less open typically to same-sex relations, you're not always talking about the same thing. And in antiquity,
we're talking strictly about binaries anymore. But
right.
but it's the idea that you've got an orientation. I mean, I assume that people in Leviticus did not think about sexual orientation.
No, they certainly did not. They certainly did not.
So they're condemning an act,
yes,
but they're not condemning an orientation. Because, a lot of people, I mean, historically, you and I have both known people, and we've probably known people who feel very guilty because they're attracted to people of the same sex. And they consider that to be a sin. But it can hardly be a sin from the Bible, because the people in the Bible didn't even know about orientation.
No, what the people in the Bible cared about was physical acts, not about your feelings. I mean, one of the things that's interesting for people who want to make a case for same-sex relations, they point to David and Jonathan. That David loved Jonathan. Well, that's not what we would call homosexuality. That's what we would call brotherly love, I think.
Well, even if it was, I mean, it's even if he was attracted to him, it's not that he would define that as orientation.
No, no.
I mean, of course, people in the ancient world wanted. I mean, the percentage of people who were homosexual in the ancient world is the same percentage as today. The brain is not. It's not that our brains have changed, and so probably.
I think I brought that point up multiple times, and I really don't like when either side try to say that we've somehow evolved in the last 1,000 years. Evolution takes millions of years. People in ancient times, as long as they're Homo sapiens sapien, have the exact same brains as us. Yes, some tendons, some bones, some minor adaptations have happened that have become mutations, that have become permanent adaptations. But the brain's still the brain. Maybe now with technology, maybe now we're going to change some things. But as of today, the human brain's still the human brain.
It's just the same number sleeping with other people. It's just that they didn't have this idea.
Yeah, it may well be. The difficulty is that today people are not in the closet in the same way that they were. And so many more people feel free to discuss their sexual identity. But
by the way, repression and suppression of homosexuality existed in the ancient world as well. So just because some cultures had a less negative view of it, the majority of cultures still did. So using ancient instances of mentions of homosexuality is not a good defense, because usually they're profoundly negative, or they're used to humiliate or degrade whoever they're speaking about. So just be careful when you try to use that as a defense of homosexuality, because you might be using something that, if they go back and look at the context of it, it's not saying what you think it's saying.
There are still cultures where it's kind of taboo. I mean, there's one of the things I learned when I was editing the book, the encyclopedia. In Native American traditions, there were individuals who were identified as two-natured or two-spirited, who were seen.
This has been slightly disproven, as it was a later concept that was trying to reinterpret an earlier native concept. But the later concept is sort of a misappropriation, or if you will, a reappropriation of the original content. So of the original concept, because the concept was lost. So they're approximating what the original two-spirit thing might have meant. So if your animal spirit and your spirit, that could be two-spirit. It could also be having a strong balance between your male and female side. So it doesn't necessarily mean what we are intimating when modern LGBTQ activists are using two-spirit. So again, you should be careful when he should be more careful because he knows better, but you should be careful when trying to use kind of callbacks to a culture that is completely not only antithetical to our current one, but the terminology that we're using is completely anachronistic for that culture. So just be careful with your language when it comes to that, because you could be saying something that's completely false, even though it makes sense to us now, because the language had not developed to encompass those ideas yet.
As holy figures who could communicate with the divine, and they were considered to have both male and female spirits. And so it's just to say that, if you're in Japan, there's one understanding. If you're in China, there's another understanding. If you're in the United States, there's still another understanding. Now,
in fact, there are lots of understandings.
Yes, there certainly are. And so, but it gets back to the question of, all right, so what's normative, what's not, and why?
The Old Testament's a big book.
It's a very big book.
And people condemn homosexuality. They don't mind doing all the other things that the prophets condemn.
Oh my word! If you want to look at condemnation of the rich against the poor, and
I think for a lot of people, most people probably are kind of interested in the Leviticus stuff, or the Sodom and Gomorrah. But once you get to Jesus, that starts really kind of where the rubber meets the road for a lot of people. Jesus does not come out and say, thou shalt not commit homosexual acts. He doesn't say that. But there's that famous passage where Jesus is asked about whether divorce is legitimate.
Yes.
And Jesus points out that in the beginning, God created male and female. And so, man shall leave his mother and woman leave her home, and the two shall cling together and be one flesh. And that seems to presuppose that the standard that Jesus has in mind is one man, one woman, for life.
I think that's right.
Okay, so Jesus is against homosexuality.
No, the question to ask Jesus is, what about Abraham and his many wives? Or what about concubines? What about, those who were celibate? Those who were celibate were not exactly looked up to as examples of what you should do. You should get married and have kids.
Yeah, and even Jesus was probably celibate. I mean, Jesus
was probably celibate.
Whatever Dan Brown tells us, he was not married with kids.
So, I think Jesus had a view of, if he ever thought about same-sex relations, who the hell knows? But if he did, he probably had a typically Jewish understanding that that's something that pagans do. That's something, that he's heard about, but has no, firsthand knowledge of, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, it is, there are people may not know that there are scholars who have argued that, in fact, Jesus and Paul were both gay in our terms. And you and I have a friend, Jeff Dill Martin, who wrote a book called Sex and the Single Savior.
Yes. And a good book it is.
Well, he was a senior professor of New Testament at Yale. So he's not somebody just kind of spouting off stuff on the internet. He's
he's not.
And so there are discussions about that kind of thing. But I think again the point surely must be that whatever Jesus said, he doesn't have our concept of sex and sexuality or homosexuality. And so to say that he condemns something he doesn't even have any language for this kind of stuff.
I know I was quiet for a lot of that, but it's the language issue that's more key for our purposes here today, which even if Jesus does have a way to tap into unlimited knowledge and this divine knowledge, his human self was limited to what was available to him as a human. So his language is limited to the context of his culture. In rough theory, you could do what movies do and say, well, if something existed beforehand, then he can just reference it. But that's not how ancient cultures work. Ancient cultures were very exclusive and they were very confined and very defined. And so to go even a little bit outside of that definition caused tremendous conflict within the community and disruption. Hence, Jesus didn't have to say huge statements to get himself crucified. Jesus got crucified saying very small statements that meant very big things in that community. So it becomes a question of what language, what cultural context did Jesus have available to him for him to use. Then you get to was he speaking Aramaic, Hebrew, or Greek? And then if he was speaking Aramaic or Hebrew, most of us think he was speaking Aramaic. When it got translated into the Koine Greek, was it a accurate translation? And given the distance between his words and the writing of them down, was the transmission solid? Like at some point, did people start changing Jesus's words? So those are the questions that arise. Okay, continuing.
That's true.
But Bible readers do point out that homosexuality is condemned. I mean, the Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 6, makes a list of activities or people
Yes.
who will not get into the kingdom of heaven, and it includes, I don't know what it includes, murderers and adulterers and whatever, and homosexuals.
Well, but again, now we're getting into translation issues, as you well know. It's a vice list, and it's kind of a generic vice list. And vice lists were rather common in antiquity. And Paul is saying, don't do these kinds of things. And so there are sexual sins. And one of the sexual sins is the Greek words are the malakoi, which literally means soft ones.
Masculine. It's a masculine malakoi. It's masculine soft people, apparently.
Yeah, soft people.
Yeah.
And then the arsenokoitai, the arson, the male who koitai goes to bed.
Okay, so let's think about this word for a second. So malakoi is non-problematic. For those of you who are not Greek scholars, malakoi just means soft. Like you can have a soft pillow, malakos pillow or something. But arsenokoites, the plural is arsenokoitai, as you say.
Right.
So does this word appear before Paul? Does he make this
one up? It does in the Septuagint, sort of.
Sort of?
Sort of. In the Leviticus passages, a man who goes to bed with another man. And so that language is used.
The word itself isn't there, right?
No.
In other words,
No.
So arson, so it's made up of two words.
Right.
So arsenokoites. So I guess people
we get coitus from
coitus, yeah. And arson is it's a form of the verb for a male, an adult male.
Yes.
And so the word means something like adult male bed.
Yes. Now, what's interesting is when you put it together with malakoi, because malakoi is clearly a euphemistic term.
Yeah.
Because if you just translate it as soft people, it makes absolutely no sense.
Means people don't work out. They'll never get into the kingdom. Go to the gym, guys.
Flabby people, you're right out. But it goes with arsenokoites. And I think the best translation would be male prostitutes and those who hire their services.
Whoa. Wow, that's interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
So, we did an episode earlier where I did an episode for the podcast with Jenny Knust,
Yes.
And we were talking about, she was on the NRSV updated edition thing, and we ended up talking about arsenokoitai because Yeah, it's really complicated because it literally means something like man beds.
Yes.
And so normally it's translated. So these two words, just so people will know what we're talking about.
So I actually don't like the updated edition. And the video that I was going to do instead of this video was that video of him and her speaking to each other because that's more concentrated. But I went with this one because this one covers more of the topics that Trent Horn and Father Casey were discussing. So I think this better informs the whole debate, while the other one just covers just this one translation issue. But still, it's a good episode. You should go watch it.
In 1 Corinthians 6, Jeff, do you know what verse this is?
6:9.
Thank you. So the verse says, all these people, including Malakoi and Arsen Koitai, will not enter into the kingdom. And so since you've got the soft and you've got the man bed, I think when we were in graduate school, what a lot of people were saying is that refers to the man who's on the receiving end of the sex act, the soft man who's behaving like a woman, and the Arsen Koitai is the man who's having sex with him. So the man who's penetrating is also condemned, so it's the passive partner and the active partner, male partners in the sex act. And that was always thought of as interesting when we were in graduate school because it is the case. You brought up several times about the Greek and Roman worlds, but it was the case, especially in Greek society, that the man who's doing the penetrating is normally not condemned because he's being a man. Men are supposed to dominate. You brought up domination earlier. Men are supposed.
Again, that's a very good point here. So this is saying that the cultural accepted act, or the exception that's accepted as a culturally accepted act, is not accepted here in Christianity. It's a way to differentiate your in-group from the out-group. Yeah, let's move ahead.
Two different degrees of things, right?
One's more powerful than the other, and you don't want to, if you're a man, you don't want to play the woman, as it were.
Paul begins his letter of 1 Corinthians by addressing it to the saints who are in Corinth.
He's being ironic.
But they're both being condemned. Okay, that would be a condemnation, but you're saying you don't think that's it at all. You think, in fact, it's somebody who is buying a male prostitute and somebody who's a male prostitute. Is that?
Well, I think that's certainly one way to interpret it, because unfortunately, some of the translations say not homosexual, some of them say sodomites, which then incorporates the whole Genesis 19 passage wrongly. And the question is whether you translate these.
I actually like when the Bible uses the word, when translations use the word sodomite there. So I'm not 100% on the same page with them, but I understand that word's probably not there in the actual original Koine Greek. But there you go.
Two words as one term, homosexuals, which some do, or whether you try and translate them as, no, they're two words. They may have a relationship to each other. They probably do. And then how do you do that? And, typically you want to go with what's going to be the most generic and least specific translation.
But the reality is it's really hard to use a word that we don't know the meaning of in order to condemn a modern practice.
Especially when it just appears kind of, in passing, literally in passing, in a vice list.
Yeah.
And the First Timothy passage, the same thing. It's in passing in a vice list.
Yeah.
And, vice lists are just clubs that you use. And the longer the list, the bigger the club you're swinging.
Yeah.
But it's not like, the fact that there are sexual sins, as it were, being identified tells you that, okay, there's some issues in Corinth with people acting in sexually immoral ways.
Yeah. Well, right. And, if everybody was condemned for everything that the Corinthians were condemned for, nobody would get into the kingdom of heaven.
That was a happening church, man.
It was,
This is Romans 1, 24 following. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own person the due penalty for their error.
Yeah, well, that was used for some horrific purposes in the 1980s.
Yes, it was. Yeah, people deserve to get AIDS.
Yeah, because they received. Yeah. So this passage,
and I talked about that and I think my very last video about how the arguments that Horn is prone to, is attracted to, have been used for horrible things. And I think that those arguments are not the wisest.
Who's Paul generally talking about here? Is he? What's the issue that these people are being turned over to degrading sexual activities?
Well, I mean, what Paul is saying, and there's a debate about this, of course, is Paul talking about creation and that God created male and female and now it's being violated? And the answer is no. Paul's talking about idolatry.
Idolatry.
And that idolatry leads to worshiping creation rather than worshiping the Creator, worshiping God. Okay. And the consequence of this is people get screwed up. They
yeah. So, but the idolatry, in other words, he's talking about all the pagans, right?
Yeah.
Like 95% of the world. So the reason they engage in this kind of crazy sexual activity, in his view, is because God's given them up.
And I mentioned this also in a previous video, where the default is that the majority of the world is going to hell. Hell is full. Heaven is only a few. So, all right, let's keep going.
Yeah, I mean, what Paul's trying to do is to say, all right, and it all comes back to sin, of course. There's Gentile sin, which is fundamentally idolatry, and there's Jewish sin, which he'll get to, which is disobedience. And everybody has sinned. Everybody's guilty so that God may eventually have mercy upon all. But here he's just trying to say that one of the consequences of idolatry is people acting in what Paul considers unnatural ways, excessively lustful. Now, again, it begs the question of what's natural and what's unnatural and what's excessively lustful and what's not. I mean,
there's a lot of begging the question in most of these conversations, I've noticed, especially on this topic, from both sides.
I think the way you take Paul seriously is taking him with his understanding as a first century Jew, a first century Christian, of relationships, sexual relationships, and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate.
Yeah, well, you certainly wouldn't take Paul, if Paul started talking about, cosmology and started talking about what the solar system is, you wouldn't take that as authoritative, right? He doesn't know.
I wouldn't, but
well, I wouldn't. I mean, if he thinks that that the sun revolves around the Earth, today we know better. Mm-hmm. And science isn't just about the stars; it's about biology. You fall in love and you get married. They didn't have anything like that. And the idea of two adults having a relationship where they decide they want to have intimacy together, there was nothing like that in the ancient world. So it's kind of hard to condemn something you've never heard of. Okay, Jeff, could you?
Unless you're doing it, unless you're anachronistic.
Unless you're anachronistic. You're pretending that you're living in the same time period as someone else when you're not. And so, yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll get there. I'm going to edit this down a lot. I hope this was informative. Maybe if this series continues on longer than 2 more videos, I will go find that video where he's talking to the person who did the language updates for the NRSV updated edition. Again, it's not a translation that I like. I own a copy of it on Kindle. I own a digital copy. I don't like the changes, but it might be worth hearing that conversation. I also have the Net Bible, the one with all the extra notes, the Net Note Bible or Notated Bible. That one has a ton of information that I recommend looking into. All right, laters.